Hey, good evening, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to the first edition of AWE Nite Los Angeles this year in 2023. Pretty excited for the show that we have put together for you this evening. We're going to be talking about a lot of things as it relates to the governance of the metaverse. And I think that that's a really exciting and popular topic, very relevant to this to today. But first and foremost, I think it's really important to recognize, we are part of the Augmented World Expo. The Augmented World Expo is, AWE United States is coming up in a few months. AWE Nite LA is a part of, a couple dozen chapters worldwide now. And we're really excited to be able to put together these events to really showcase all the exciting mindshare that's going on as it relates to the augmented technology industry. If you're here, you've made it to AWE.live, which is kind of the receptacle for all things Augmented World Expo. Thanks for checking out our event. There's all kinds of other incredible events and content that is here as well from prior years of AWE conferences, as well as the events that we put on, as well as other chapters put on around the world. With AWE coming up, please use 23 AWE Nite SD. I bet it also works with LA as well. For a 20% discount to the show that's coming up in a few months. And here's our calendar. So we'll see you at the end of May for AWE here in the United States, but then also we have an Asia contingent, a European contingent, and then all 24/7 you can find us here at AWE.live. Additionally, this is actually from last year, so this already happened. Never mind. But you can find the talks probably from this at AWE.live. Additionally, there's all kinds of other content. If you're a big fan of Charlie Fink or Ted Schilowitz, all kinds of other creators also making content on the platform. There's plenty of content here to check it out. But I think most importantly, we're here to talk about the metaverse. We're here to talk about the governance of the metaverse and some of the very exciting sort of organizations and policies that are being discussed as it relates to the growing of this incredible thing. So I'd love to turn it over to Susan to introduce the event of this evening and introduce her incredible panel of speakers.
Thank you, Ray. Where are the speakers? So I can introduce them. There we go. Thank you. We're missing Evo. There we go. Hi, everybody. So just as a little bit of background about how this panel was formed, Neil and David and I, along with Ayusa from W3C, spoke at the conference of AWE in Santa Clara last year, and since we're all from LA, we decided to kind of have a continuation and talk about what's evolved since then. Unfortunately, Ayusa couldn't make it tonight, but we have Evo and Nadine, and so Evo is the XR Guild Secretary, along with Avi, who's going to be joining us later in this conversation. And she is also the Metaverse Standards Forum 3D Asset Interoperability Group. And Neil is the president of the Kronos Group and the VP developer of the ecosystems at NVIDIA. And he's also the chair of the Metaverse Standards Forum, which we're going to talk about momentarily. And then David Morin is the president of the Academy Software Foundation and Industry Relations at Epic Games. And Nadine, you're the CEO at Open Geospatial Consortium. So hello, everybody.
Hey.
So one of the main things I think that's evolved since last May or June from the AWE conference is that the Metaverse Standards Forum has been announced. And I want, Neil, for you to talk a little bit about how that came together and how it's organized and the role that it's taking. And I just also want to mention that everybody on the panel is representing an organization that participates in the Metaverse Standards Forum. So give us a little history and tell us what they're up to. You all are up to.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you, Susan. So I think there's many discussions and debates about what the metaverse is going to be, but I think the one thing we can all agree on is that one of the things that's driving the interest in the industry around the whole metaverse is we're bringing together all kinds of technologies that haven't worked together before. So whether it's 3D graphics and simulation, there's machine learning, there's XR, there's all the Web3 stuff. And as soon as you have things needing to work together, you need interoperability. And as soon as you want interoperability to scale out pervasively, you need interoperability standards. And there are dozens, maybe hundreds of organizations in the industry that are creating standards and policies for the metaverse, bringing all of these technologies together. And a lot of companies were beginning to approach the standards organizations, including Kernels, saying, we're confused. It's a very complex landscape. There's nowhere to go and talk to all of the standards orgs in one place, nowhere to coordinate and communicate as to how we want standardization for the metaverse to occur. And that was the genesis story for the Metaverse Standards Forum. The Metaverse Standards Forum, it's not another SDO, because that would just make the problem even worse. SDO is a standards developing organization. It's a coordination place. It's a venue for all the organizations making standards to come, to cooperate and communicate with the larger industry. And our mission at the Metaverse Standards Forum is to help all of these other organizations achieve their goals faster and better. And we were founded back in June last year, 2022. We had 37 founding organizations. And when we launched, I thought we'd be lucky to get a couple dozen more, but we're now at 2,200 plus organizations, and we're busy initiating a bunch of different projects. We can talk about some of them later, about how we're going to evolve the interoperability for standards with real world grounded projects in a bunch of different domains.
And real world metaverse is included in that, right?
It's true. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. It's very exciting. And I think the response that you got was really a testament of how important and how hungry people were for a place to coordinate all of these many, many efforts. Nadine, I wanted to ask you, what types of standards are we talking about, and what are the priority areas that the OGC is working on that are related to the metaverse?
Yeah, thank you, Susan, and thank you for the invitation. It's so great to be here. I love hearing Neil explain why openness and interoperability are great for an open metaverse. I learn something from him every time, so I just want to share my appreciation for him essentially being the driving force behind the Metaverse Standards Forum. I'm very proud the Open Geospatial Consortium, OGC, was one of the founding members, one of the, the first 37. And I was looking actually, right now we're active in 3 of these working groups within the Metaverse Standards Forum, and they relate essentially to our priority areas. So one was the Metaverse Standards Register, because as Neil said, there's a universe of standards, and the metaverse is not something that any one person, organization, or discipline can just put together. You have to bring them all. 3D asset interoperability, and I'll tell you why, because I don't know if you're familiar with geospatial, but when we talk about geospatial, sometimes people say location, right, where things are. But what we're doing is essentially bringing the real world, or bridging the real world with the virtual world. So if you think the geospatial community encodes things like the roads and the underground infrastructure and the buildings, and then tracks the energy consumption and everything related to the environment, air quality, water quality, is all geospatial information. The modeling, right, of everything that is science, right? So flood modeling, landslide modeling, hurricanes, climate change, I'll talk about it later. So that's all geospatial. So when I say we bring the real world, that's what we're bringing, right? The models of the real world all the way to the metaverse. So that's why we're very interested in the asset interoperability, because we deal with buildings and indoor, right? All of that. And then there's the real virtual world integration working group, which, you know, makes sense. So in a way, our priority, so our mission at OGC is to make geospatial information or location information fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that's what we're doing here. So that's our priority. Is there's a world of data. There's a world of data representing our Earth and our universe, right? From under the Earth, under the oceans all the way to space. That finally, I think we're at a place where you can leverage and put it all together to create this metaverse. And that's our priority right now. The 3D modeling, the modeling side of things, the streaming of all this huge, huge amounts of real information or synthetic that is so close to real, you wouldn't even believe it until you see it. So I think I'll stop at this and then we can have a conversation. But to us, we say the metaverse is geospatial because eventually you got to model something that looks like the real world. And there are a lot of use cases for good, right? For the good, where this is really just the right time to do this. Helps? Works?
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here. I was a founding member of the Open AR Cloud, and I know that they've worked closely with you all on the GeoPose standard. And because I work in geospatially located AR, I'm particularly excited to have you here. So thank you so much. And we have James Jackson is going to be joining us a little bit later in the conversation. So David, I didn't forget about you and your request to share and promote about your event. So you want to go ahead and do that, and then I'll introduce you.
Okay, sure. So maybe so people know what I'm going to bring up. At the Academy Software Foundation, we have our mission is to support open source and the development of open source libraries that eventually makes it as open standard. And there's an event that is going to happen next week in Los Angeles called the Open Source Forum 2023. I'll just share this quickly as a visual reference. So the Open Source Forum is on February 16th in the afternoon, and at the Academy Museum in person and online. There is a complete program, and some of it relate to what we're talking about here. You're welcome to join audience in both in person or online by going to the following link to sign up for the Linux Foundation Open Source Forum, and I'll put that link in here so that you can refer to it. This is a place where we're going to talk about all kind of projects that are within the motion picture industry that are used to do movies, and that are used also more and more in other spheres, including some libraries, open source libraries that we're going to discuss here. And I'm going to stop sharing. So that's my commercial.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I know that open source and open standards often gets collapsed. And I think that what the Academy of Software Foundation plays a really important role in terms of supporting open source efforts. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I think in the context of our discussions here, the motion picture industry has been developing over time a lot of computer graphics algorithm for rendering photoreal and imagery of all sorts, and it graduated from being computer graphics works that was done on a shot or another of a live action movie to now being entire movies generated. I don't need to name any names. I think we all know what that is, and animation movies that have also been generated entirely for quite some times now. And these algorithms have found their way in all different markets than motion picture, where essentially wherever there is visualization today, you can trace the algorithm to the engineers of the motion picture industry in part that contributed that. And a lot of that technology is open source, has been open source by engineers that saw early on that that kind of technology would serve everyone. And it would also be kind of silly that it's rewritten, reinvented in 5 different studios or 25 different vendors. And these technologies were put out there to be used. There are thousands of open source projects. Not all of them are successful, but from time to time, you have some that become open standards. So kind of the bottom-up approach to standards developed by engineers and adoption make these technologies something that is used by everyone. So at the Academy Software Foundation, our role is to provide a platform so that some of these projects can be onboarded and supported through a membership model at the Academy Software Foundation. Our primary goal is to help the development of open source in the motion picture industry, but we're also there to be good custodian of technologies that are used all over, coming from the motion picture industry.
Thank you, David. I think we're going to talk a little bit tonight about how the motion picture industry and the web and the metaverse are all kind of starting to cross over into each other. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we dive deeper into the conversation. So Eva, I know that you're very focused on 3D asset interoperability in a number of different avenues. You're very concerned about artist attribution ethics and generative art. And I know that you had your book, Prompt Craft, about generative art.
It went out last week. Yeah, it came out a couple of days ago. So Prompt Craft released last week on Kindle and in paperback. And I think Ray just got his copy, so it's shipping.
I am sorry about that overlap on the video. I'm not sure what happened.
Yeah, I lost your audio. Sorry.
What?
I lost your audio.
Okay. That's good. That's good that you lost it because I got an overlap. So did you want to say, that was a very quick description of your book. Do you want to say a little bit more about the work you're doing with the Metaverse Standards Forum, the XR Guild, and how that all kind of comes together?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a creator producer. I have been in what is now Metaverse media for about 20 years. I started out in interactive media. And as a creator, as an artist, I have always been collaborating with other folks on these edge topics. And so working with Neil during the pandemic, we began talking about meta-traversal and what does it mean to move between our metaverse worlds? What are the agreements that come to mind? How do we make those handshakes effectively together? And some of those conversations we were already having in open source communities. I co-lead a community called Open Metaverse Interoperability, or OMI group. And that group is one of the groups that sits within the Metaverse Standards Forum from an open source point of view, as a group of independent developers doing independent R&D on things like GLTF extensions. So how do we make those 3D art objects on the metaverse? How do we make those more interactive and effective and portable? How do we maintain attribution as those assets, as those art objects are shared? How do we maintain some sense of permissions, trackability, all of the things that those recipes that are happening in the 3D asset interop group that got mentioned earlier are vital to figuring out, because that affects artists all over the world as we begin to create in XR, in AR, and then bring our things across worlds, right? We need to make sure that that the creator, that the producer, and that the collaborators together know what those agreements are going to be like. So I sit with XR Guild. I'm vice president of the board now. We just had our new elections, and thank you, Susan, for helping us to guide that organization to be something that can be both local for those who work in the XR industry, and also as a place globally where we can have conversations about ethical engagement, or what does it mean to share our data together.
Thank you so much. And it's interesting. I think you're doing something that didn't happen for the web and the 2D world in terms of attribution and assets, right? That it's not something that, it's not something that was very well thought through in that iteration. And I love seeing that you're really thinking about that. It's an opportunity to see, like, well, what did we do wrong and how can we make things better as we move into this new space? And I also want to mention the XR Guild, that Avi, the president and founder of the XR Guild, is going to also be joining us a little bit later in the conversation. And I know he has lots of things to say and many opinions about the metaverse. So we'll get to hear from him shortly. So why don't we get this particular question kind of out of the way? Let's talk a little bit about the general state of the metaverse, the ongoing confusion with metaverse, web, RTX, and pushback on XR dystopian futures. Neil, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, because I am a big believer in the metaverse. I think, as we were saying before, now bringing together these technologies is going to create a wavefront of new business opportunities. It's going to be hard to know how things exactly evolve. Asking someone today, what is the metaverse going to be in 20 years' time? It's like sitting someone down in front of the Netscape browser in 1994 and saying, what's the web going to be like in 30 years? No, you're not going to get anything close to reality. It's just impossible. But a whole set of interesting things are going to happen. But we're probably going to go through hype cycles, I imagine, too. And it's actually quite interesting. We just came back from discussions at CES, talking to a lot of content devs there, and for them, just the term, the metaverse, is a double-edged sword. It creates a lot of interest. We're here now talking about the metaverse, but it also comes with some baggage, and I think it's going to need the metaverse community to work hard to explain and educate the plus and the positives of the metaverse, and to try to explain why some of these negative connotations are not correct. And some of them that were coming up at CES were, I mean, there's confusion over just the name. I love what Meta is doing, but Meta and Metaverse are confusing. A lot of people just think that the Metaverse is just going to be Meta, and even Meta would not want anyone to think that. There's confusion around XR. I know this is AWE, but now people are thinking the only way to access the metaverse is to plug yourself into a VR helmet for 8 hours a day. And I think that's a very damaging perception too. That's kind of dystopian to a lot of folks. And, and in many quarters, we're finding metaverse is getting branded with that kind of dystopian concern. And of course, Web3, we're going to need decentralized trust that the Web3 community is going to figure that out. But with all the negative press around, crypto and stuff right now, that's also a drag on the metaverse. So as well as actually working on all these standards and getting all this interop to happen, we need everyone who's interested in the success of the metaverse to be out there, explaining how it's not as bad as you think, and actually stressing that the positives of what the metaverse is going to bring to the world.
So would any of you like to weigh in on that? I know, Ivo, you have some thoughts on that. Because you're someone who's out there trying to communicate and bring awareness to the positives. So you want to talk a little bit about how you do that?
Bridging gaps is ongoing, right? So many of us are going out to talk to communities, make videos, do the sort of language conversation around how do we translate our work to the general public so that people understand that the vastness of an open metaverse can be much more than these sort of top 5 companies they've heard of. Much of that happens peer-to-peer, person-to-person, or it happens through things like blog posts, YouTube posts, the kinds of things that, you know, many of us are doing in our day-to-day work. I lead the OMI group community as a place where those community leaders, whether open source developers or researchers, can land, just because there wasn't a lot of space for that conversation to thrive a couple of years ago. Now we have places like MSF, we have places where people can plug in at a professional level, but we don't necessarily do a great job of bringing people up from the beginning, mentorship, reaching out at the educational level, making sure that we are bringing in new professional leaders, right, in AR and in XR, and also bridging the language gaps around what does the real world metaverse look like, right? How does that translate to those who are maybe in school now or are thinking about how all of these things are going to come together? Our field has changed so much so fast. And we haven't necessarily done a great job of creating a glossary of terms that the rest of the general public can get their head around yet. So I think we have a lot of work to do together. And these conversations start to unpack that. And then we can do a lot more in terms of short form content together, I think, for the general public.
Yeah, Nadine, definitely in terms of location based. What are your thoughts?
So it's interesting you mentioned this confusion between Meta and Metaverse and XR. So in October, we created a new working group in the Open Geospatial Consortium that's Geo for the Metaverse. And when we create a working group in OGC, just like any, you know, open standards organization, we have the whole membership. So all of our 580 member organizations come in and they have to say, you know, it's consensus, right? And that conversation about this specific working group was very interesting because it's almost like the instinct of people is like, oh, you're jumping on the bandwagon as well, right? Because everybody's talking about the metaverse, or ew, right? We're like sort of like, you know, on a higher ground or something. It's like this metaverse thing. And eventually, I think what we need to remind ourselves is it's not the hype and it's not the technology, even though it's amazing. I'm a geek, so I'm an MIT geek. I always say that, but it's the why. And so for us, in this case, it's using, like Ivo said, the bridging of these worlds for the first time, right? The fact that we have, you know, in OGC, for example, we have the Epic Games and the Cesium and NVIDIA, right? With these, you know, they're bringing seriously new worlds to the rest of our membership that includes, you know, the NASA and the Maxar and the planets of the world and the Black Shark with the, you know, Microsoft simulator. And it's just like this bridging is amazing. And that brings me to the why, right? Which I think, for instance, I'll throw it because I'm very passionate about it. Imagine when we all put our heads together and our technologies together and our data together and our imaginations together, what we can do to accelerate our understanding of our climate, right? So climate understanding, I'm not calling it climate change or anything, but you bring all of this and you start to actually, you know, bring it down to the person level, right? So you imagine you're sitting in your house and you say, I want to go into this environment and see where my house is going to end up 30 years from now, based on various climate scenarios. Imagine the power on a personal level and on a political level and so on. And I think that's the distinction in a way. It's something really an environment that would help us, you know, explore things we've never been able to explore at this scale before. And that's why it's different from anything else. It's not Meta, it's not XR, it's not anything. It's what you can do with this amazing environment that we can bring together. So I'm excited, like Neil, about this possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that unfortunately the metaverse doesn't capture all of the richness that you're talking about. And that's the education that we have to do, is getting people to understand this huge concept of, you know, our understanding of the metaverse, which includes geospatially located. It's not just put on a headset. I think it's really hard for the public to wrap their heads around that. So there's a lot of work ahead we have on that. David, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yes, sure. From maybe a counterpoint and then a counterpoint. From the motion picture industry, we have a lot of movies that have portrayed the metaverse, right? From Ready Player One to Tron way back when, to Minority Report, Avatar in a way, Strange Days, Inception, the Matrix series. There's been a lot of these visualization of what the metaverse could be. But from that point of view, we have to admit that they've been more dystopian than happy in the way it all goes. So I think, and of course, it's more entertaining to see something dystopian than something that's totally happy. So the motion picture industry will go that way. But I think that's why it emphasizes our responsibility and our mission to go and really portray the potential of the metaverse in a way that goes away from that, learns from all those dark visions of what it could be, and really plan properly for what the metaverse, for setting the base for what it can be. In my day job, I work at Epic Games, and we're very committed to the metaverse as a positive and future environment. And that comes in our case from the work that has been done around the Fortnite game and the development of it as this worldwide environment, interactive environment, where people have been able to come and play at a time where nobody could go outside and play physically with people, and that created a big change. We believe that it's one part of the metaverse is like this, but we also believe that it has to be open, that it's not just Fortnite, it's not just Roblox, it's not just the environments that will be created by all the different companies. It's the sum of all this connected together in an environment that people can move seamlessly from one to the other through. And that's why interoperability is so important. And that's why the mission of the Metaverse Standards Forum is so important. And Epic has played a leadership role in helping establish it through the work of Mark Petit. So where we have a big task ahead of us. We don't define it very precisely because it's difficult and perhaps impossible to do, but we want to set the base for that future that are solid and that can allow the metaverse to grow on the base. And we're lucky to have a good example in the internet, right? The metaverse is built on the internet, and there is a history there of open standard, open source that made it possible so that throughout the world people could communicate into the way we're doing it now. And the metaverse needs to be an extension of that, where the technology remains open, remains designed together, and a big part of the software stack need to be open and free, and done by people like here and Neil and the whole group of people who work on specifying what it should be now, moving from here.
And I love that you brought up Fortnite, because I just imagine, like, wouldn't that be so cool to play in real life? Right? Like in geospatially located Fortnite, like that would be so cool. I'm not sure how that would, happen, but that's the image that always comes to mind when we're having this conversation and you bring up Fortnite.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it definitely was a lifesaver during COVID for my kids, I know for sure. So Neil, what are some of the domain topics that are creating the most interest among the forum members and the wider industry?
Yeah, it's a good question, because having over 2,000 members is awesome, because it lets us gather a lot of industry input and get a lot of industry visibility for all of the organizations that are members. But of course, there's also a potential for chaos, having so many members if you don't organize properly. So what we've done is set up a domain group pipeline. So the first thing we did was poll all of the members to find out what were their top of mind topics that the forum should begin to address, either problems that are really hurting or opportunities that are kind of lying in wait. And we immediately got 250 topics. And then we gathered those into domains, because a lot of them obviously were quite closely related. They clustered fairly naturally. And lots of the topics that were at top of the list were perhaps not too surprising. At the beginning, it was 3D asset interoperability was the clear one. And then avatars, which is a type of 3D asset, but being able to take your avatar around different places. The real virtual world integration that we've been talking about, digital twins, was definitely up there high on the list, along with education and XR. And so not so surprising. It's good to see those topics bubbling towards the top. But the one that perhaps is surprising, I'm ashamed to admit it was surprising to me personally, but I'm very happy that the one that's actually kind of came up through the ranks and is now #1 is ethics and privacy and security. And I think that does speak to what you were saying earlier. We're fortunate we have the opportunity to learn from the Web 2.0 experience, which has brought many wonderful things to the world, but also not so wonderful things too. And I think a lot of folks are looking at the metaverse as an opportunity to not repeat some of those same mistakes, and to bake in some of the considerations around ethics and privacy and security into the foundation of the metaverse. So this new generation platform can be open and inclusive and a safe place for everyone to be. I think it's really important, because because the potential for abuse is much higher. XR, as we all know, XR devices are going to gather so much intimate personal information at a rate way more than you clicking on a web browser. The potential for abuse is much higher. If people lose trust in this whole concept, the metaverse may not recover for a long time. So, for anyone who has an interest in the success of the metaverse, I'm glad this is bubbled up as topic #1 to think about.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that. I've loved seeing there's so much concern about it, but I think there's more discussion about it than there is concern, and I think that's really great to see. David, so I know that the Academy Software Foundation is in collaboration with the Linux Foundation, which I think most people on the webinar today are probably familiar with the Linux Foundation. And they just announced the Open Metaverse Foundation. And I think they're trying to do something similar to the Metaverse Standards Forum. Can you talk a little bit about that and your relationship with the Linux Foundation? And then I want to open it up to the rest of you. Like, how do all of these organizations coordinate and have, and I know, Nadine, you work with a lot of organizations. So do you, Ivo. How do they all come together?
Yeah, so the Academy Software Foundation is created in collaboration between the Academy of Motion Picture Art and Science and the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation is well known. It has been around for a long time, and its mission is to help the development of open source in all its form. it has hundreds of foundations and projects that are going. And so the Open Metaverse Foundation that was just created was in the works for quite a while, and came out in part out of the Open 3D Engine Foundation that exists as a sort of a sister project to the Academy Software Foundation. And the roles, the goals are similar. That is true. It talks to a number of the Linux Foundation projects that had a plan and a vector into the metaverse themselves. And so it's another player. I think it talks to the interest with the 2,200 companies of the Metaverse Standards Forum. Actually did not capture everyone that had an interest in the metaverse. So this is one that came out from the Linux Foundation. We can expect that there'll be convergence and that there'll be work that will be done together between all those organizations. And from our part at the Academy Software Foundation, we've been a supporter of the Metaverse Standards Forum since the beginning because of a number of reasons. Our libraries are going to be used, we know, in different ways, and we want to make sure we support them well. And we are very committed to the Metaverse Standards Forum from that direction, and so is Epic Games.
So you're maybe one of the pieces that are going to help glue those two organizations together.
Yes, there's not a lack of diplomatic work to do, and we're certainly committed to do that.
Great. So Nadine, Ivo, do you want to talk about how you all manage your collaborations amongst so many different groups?
Yeah, sure. So I think we live in an amazing world, right? I mean, I was just checking out the Open Metaverse Foundation, so thank you, checking it out online. I think this is, again, this is so great because everything is starting with the word open, which is great, you know, so open geospatial, open metaverse, open interoperability. So that's really, really good. And I think eventually it's a specialization, and it could be specialization by the technology or just by your interests, right? And it underlines, I think, this need for interoperability because there are so many different working groups. And this idea, I think, Neil, that mentioned earlier, this concept of nobody's trying to create this comprehensive model and, do the one-to-one connections. It's actually more like this live ecosystem, and everything is just like it's out there, and we're all just trying to make sure that when two things come together, they actually can bond, right, and create something bigger. So for us, we're like I mentioned, founding members of the Metaverse Standards Forum, mostly listening to see what gaps there are, interoperability for what people use, whether it's geospatial location and whatever. And how do we, it's the education, I think Ivo mentioned, right? So we need to educate the world so that, to me, one of my concerns usually is, please don't reinvent the wheel. Please don't do something we've already done before. Take it, it's free. Right? So I think it's that two-way that it's, events like this help. And the SIGGRAPH, when we did, Neil, the course at SIGGRAPH, that helps as well because there's still different players there, right? Epic Games and Roblox, and we talked about all of this. So I think it's just, we have to understand that right now it's everything. And so we need to be aware of what's happening. And as long as our intent is I think, genuine, that we're really trying to build an open metaverse, we can connect the pieces. Again, I don't know, I wave my hands a lot, but I feel
Ivo, do you want to weigh in?
Just to add to that, we are all doing our best to make sure that the doors are open wider, and making sure that more people can come in those doors, whether they are from countries we haven't heard from yet in the AR and XR space, especially because obviously this conversation is relatively centered in a region, and our industry is much broader now. So whether it's Neil at MSF or what David's doing, what Nadine's doing, we're all trying to figure out how to open the door wider to individual contributors, to those who are learning and are becoming professionals in our space, to collaborative groups that don't look like a traditional institution, might look like a DAO and a Web3 group, right? So, you know, each of us are trying to find a different path, or maybe working together. For example, what we do with MSF and OMI is, if you're an individual open source contributor, you can be a part of OMI and then participate at MSF, even if you don't have a big company under your hood, right? So there's always a path forward, but making sure that that path is a way in that people can find. Right now, those doors, they are saying open, but they're not easy to find. And that's one of the work that we all have to do together this year.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's awesome, the Open Metaverse Foundation that Linux Foundation has set up. I mean, the Linux Foundation has so much awesome skill and experience in building open source projects. I mean, ASWF is one great example, the Open 3D engine that David mentioned. So the fact that the Linux Foundation are kind of trying to bring their projects together and try to get at what's the metaverse value, that, you know, all the open source skills and activities that the Linux Foundation has under their umbrella. I think it's an awesome thing, and hopefully you know, the Metaverse Standards Forum can add value, because that, again, that is our mission, not to compete with all of these groups throughout the industry doing this great work, but to accelerate them and to provide them more input, to give them more visibility. And so, you know, we look forward to working with the Open Metaverse Foundation. There are other kind of consortia too that have joined the Metaverse Standards Forum, the OMA3, you know, the Open Metaverse Alliance for Web3. They've joined as well because, you know, they want to get visibility and input from, you know, the wider group, the more diverse group, you know, at the Metaverse Standards Forum, that's bringing people together from, you know, all angles and perspectives. You know, that is the value that we hope that the Metaverse Standards Forum is bringing, you know, and, you know, we welcome all of the groups that are joining, and we want to help them succeed.
Yeah, I'm just thinking a little bit about like comparing now to being a web developer back in the early 90s, and you know, the relative scale of the issues is so much bigger than the browser wars, and having to write code for all the different browsers and how frustrating that was. And then when there were standards, it was so much easier to build web pages, right? And right now, you know, as a creator, I'm up against the same thing and trying to bring different technologies together into one experience. And it's really hard because everything's being built independently, you know, and I relish the day when there is interoperability. And I know there are definitely projects that are moving in that direction. But yeah, as a creator, it's really hard without the standards. Yeah, and then just, it's like, I don't know, exponential to the third power, more complicated than what was going on in the web browser, right? It's the landscape is so much bigger and so much more complex.
Yeah, there's more than enough interoperability work to go around.
Yeah,
you don't need fighting over it. You should be cooperating over it. Yeah.
So I want to move into talking a little bit more about the USD standard and 3D interoperability and how all that fits with geospatial. And so I want to bring in James Jackson from the Open Air Cloud to join this part of the conversation. James has, so James just needs to get logged in. Let's give him a minute to do that. And Goopy, you're on board. I'm going to help if there's, there he is. No, that's Avi. Hey, Avi.
Hello.
I was going to introduce you ever so shortly.
That's fine. I'll wait.
We have an echo. Thank you.
James
there.
is not here yet.
Oh, that's not James. That's Goopy.
Yeah, James is not here yet. So
Okay.
Would you like us, me and David, to talk about USD and GLTF?
Well, actually, since Avi is here, why don't we start the... There's James.
There's James.
Hey. Sorry, I didn't think I'd have to fill out so many fields.
Okay. It's the magic link wasn't so magic. Okay. So welcome, Avi and James. Very excited to have both of you here. So the next conversation I want to have is around the Universal Scene Description Standard and how that's been adopted by NVIDIA for their Omniverse platform. And I know that we had a lot of conversations early on, James, about how do we describe a 3D scene in the real world, and how does all of this, this is a big conversation where a lot of things kind of come together with the 3D asset interoperability and the description and the geopose and the geospatial coordinates. So is that a good enough introduction? Can you guys kind of just jump in? Dave, why don't you start out with the evolution of USD? How did the Universal Scene Description come about? Because I know you work with it quite a lot at Epic. So why don't you tell us a little bit about its history? And then
Yes.
Neil, maybe you can tell us about its adoption into Omniverse. We'll go from there.
That sounds great. So in short, Universal Scene Description was invented at Pixar when they had to, or they decided that they were going to rewrite their asset management system within the company, and they had done many generations of that. That sort of effort, managing assets for big movies that are all done digitally and virtually, has been done in many different, every studio doing this kind of work had their own custom system. And lots of people were thinking about, okay, well, if we're at Pixar, as the story is told by Steve May and Guido Caroni and those who were involved in creating this, it was like, okay, we're doing another one here, and everybody's going to come in and redo their own systems because technology evolves. Wouldn't it be nice if we were sharing this with the world? And it's always a kind of a pitch when you pitch that to your management to say, we're going to take this technology and make it open. But they convinced their management, and they did it. And they created USD for their own purpose, for their own need. To this day, they're making movies every day with USD. And they made it open source. And what happened is really, because it was well designed, and the other studios looked at it and decided to adopt it instead of rebuilding everything themselves. And there was a sort of a snowball effect in the motion picture industry around USD, and just enough flexibility to be able to allow other studios to do it their own way, depending on their own technology stack, but at the same time enough specification and in the schemas that it specifies, so that there was a standard way that was emerging. So that's how it started. And then to everyone's surprise, Pixar included, USD started to be used in other industries for by other organizations, by software vendors that learned to deal with USD in the motion picture industry, and brought that to other industries like NVIDIA with their Omniverse system. And that's how USD came to be a system, an open system to help manage the construction of worlds. So it's not just a system to deal with a world that has been built. It's a system that deals with constructing a world, and a world that is constantly being created. And how do you manage that with a lot of creators all working at the same time, and now all working remote in the world? USD is doing that. But it does not specify the data that is manipulated. It specifies how to manipulate the data, but it doesn't specify the leaves of the system. And this is where GLTF comes in.
Neil, I think that's your cue.
Yeah, no, I think USD and GLTF are going to be super complementary, and USD is awesome technology, as David's described. And GLTF is interesting and potentially complementary because it's coming from a very different design starting point, which is we need very efficient 3D assets that we can load up into the web, we can load into web pages, and it's got to be very widely understood and can be processed anywhere, even on your mobile phone in the web browser. And so we like to say it's kind of an analogy that works, but GLTF is like the JPEG of 3D. So if USD is going to be how you describe complete scenes, the analogy to a web page today is like the HTML. But the HTML layout, all the interesting stuff is in the pictures and the videos that go into the web page, and GLTF will be used in many cases as those leaf nodes, as David describes it, the actual assets that get loaded in. Now, USD is looking more and more towards the runtime, and GLTF started out as runtime is looking more and more towards scene composition and behaviors. There's a big danger that the two kind of collide and duplicate a lot of work, which is why I think the 3D asset interoperability working group at the Metaverse Standards Forum is important, because for the first time we have the USD folks and the GLTF folks coming together around the same table to make sure that we can complement each other's work and build a better roadmap together for the good of the industry. And it's the first time we've had that happen, and that's a kind of a good exemplar of kind of the good work that we want the forum to be able to enable.
And Neil, for people who might not know what GLTF is, can you just do a high-level description?
Yeah, GLTF is a Kronos standard. It's not an open source project. USD is primarily an open source project. GLTF is an open specification. So then there's a specification and conformance tests, and it just describes 3D assets, animation, materials, and soon behaviors and all kinds of stuff. Everything that you need to describe a 3D asset, and soon a metaverse asset with properties and behaviors.
And can you talk a little bit about what those properties and behaviors are that would be specific to the metaverse?
Yes. So for example, if you have a wrench, I'm trying to think of an object, a wrench, a virtual wrench that you're taking with you from metaverse world to metaverse world. You describe the physical appearance. I mean, that's a 3D asset format. But then you drop your wrench into the virtual swimming pool. Does it float or does it sink? And that's a property of the asset, that you can get the asset to participate in a physical simulation environment. Or you can program in behaviors. So it might be a car door. If you pull the handle, the door will open with the sound and animations and physics simulations. So behaviors and properties are kind of what elevate a 3D asset format into a more useful asset in the metaverse.
Got it. Thank you. The floor is open.
I think we
Yeah,
got James, because you're using GLTF, right, in geospatial, and Open Geospatial Consortium is using GLTF a lot.
Yeah. So I'm coming at it from the real virtual integration group that we've been running along with OGC. The areas where this really factors in are sort of how we represent the real world, right? That digital twin, or that ideally is created in a collaborative manner, as well as how we represent the spatial experiences that we layer on top of it. And then how do we connect those spatial experiences to the real world representation? There's a lot of overlap between all of these areas, right? Of course, we want to be able to do it in an efficient manner, as Neil mentioned. Like, you definitely don't want to preclude the ability to run things within a browser environment. We're, very big fans of the web mindset in general, and making sure that that's a path that we can continue to support. But there's certainly a tremendous amount of work that is to be done in this overall space of looking at what's the equivalent of HTML, CSS, JPEG in this new world, right?
Yeah, I know that's a conversation that happened a lot in Open AR Cloud. Ivo, Nadine?
Well, I think, sorry, I can comment. I mean, James is way more, let's say, intimate, I think, with this, the virtual real integration at the technical level. But this concept of digital twins, right, which is where the 3D assets, belong or live. And just as an example, recently I was at the ITSEC conference down in Orlando. So this is the military modeling and simulation. So by the way, they're also talking about the metaverse and in that modeling and simulation world. And you go to the showroom, right, the exhibit floor, and everybody is presenting, sort of like their metaverse. Right? And then you ask them what's behind this. It's their model for digital twins. And you can totally see, you can see after 3 booths, like, oh my God, how would these digital twins interoperate? How can I get a city from a place and a city from another place, or maybe roads from a place and buildings from another place for the same city or county or whatever? And I think this is where I think the 3D, the asset interoperability helps, because it's not just a wrench, it can grow at that scale to build those digital twins, and then where that virtual and the real world integration can help. Otherwise, it's quickly becoming total chaos, right? And this is not even talking about what David was talking about, which is in the motion picture. Right, so bring that into that whole mix, and I think that's exactly why it's. I appreciate the project about the 3D asset and USD being just an open source, and how can we harmonize with GLTF and our 3D tiles from geospatial, etc., etc. It's a big problem, but it's a good problem to start with.
And maybe so much of this is in the public sphere. It's in our public parks. It's how we need to make decisions together when a disaster strikes, right? Because if we're all in our AR smart glasses and I have a different data set than you do, our first responders aren't working with the same information. And that's why interoperability on those assets matters at all sectors and all stages. It doesn't matter if you're in entertainment or if you are a police officer, a firefighter, someone who's trying to deal with a disaster in real time that might affect more than one jurisdiction or country. So I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing, Nadine, specifically, but also NVIDIA around digital twins, making sure that all of our aspects of what is public life are interoperable. Because whether we're talking about something that's an art object, or we're talking about something where thousands of people are passing through a park in real time, we need to make sure that we are speaking the same language and working with the same data. It's going to take us a long time. We're not obviously anywhere close to that yet. And what you've seen are many different organizations who are holding some piece of the puzzle, right? Nadine's organization understands digital twins in a way that very few do, and they can inform the process. But we still have to all keep talking to each other so that we are informing that together. The back channeling that's been happening between these organizations, it's hard to describe how much that has changed how we work together, especially during the pandemic. So much of this has been virtual, right? And I'm just grateful for, being able to sit down with each of you, whether it's at the forum or in a conversation like here, where we can actually get into the details of how this works together. I've been grateful, especially for Avi here. And Avi reached out, it was during the pandemic, we didn't know each other. But as folks who work in the XR industry, we saw similar pain points. And these were pain points around data and attribution, but also around privacy and what information is being passed as we're having these relationships. So I don't think any of this happens unless we choose to collaborate effectively and, as you said earlier, openly in the public space.
So I think that's a great segue to introduce Avi. Avi is the president of the XR Guild, and I think that's where you two are collaborating. And I know that you are an architect and advisor and pioneer in the XR space for many years. So welcome, Avi.
Hi, thanks, and hopefully fix the echo at this point, so that's not a problem. Yeah, thanks for having me, and it's great to work with Evo, and I'm trying to help Neil as much as I can on the MSF, and I love to be as helpful as possible. Now that I'm no longer working for working 80 hours a week inside a big company, I have a little more time also to help with that. I've been dealing with this for a long time. When I was back at Keyhole, we had this thing that turned into Google Earth, and that was one of the key problems. Everything you're discussing was, how do we get all the data onto one globe so that people can share it, so people can experience it, and everybody can see a marked up globe? And it's not easy. Everybody has their own data sets. Everybody has their own reasons to act the way they act. Everybody's being rational, but yet they always go in different directions. So seeing everybody come together around standards is super important. I guess one of the things I wanted to follow on with the stuff that Eva's been talking about, and Neil especially was talking about ethics, is the added difficulty of ethics. So I'm gonna just be real about this. Not that anybody isn't, but these things are sometimes hard to say, because different companies have different business models, and so the definition of ethics may vary from company to company, and it's hard enough to get them to agree on ABCs of data formats. But now we also have behaviors and operational models and things like that we're going to need to come together on. And I'll give you an example of where we see this happening. Like, first of all, I think we would all agree that none of us wants any single company to be in control of the metaverse, or whatever we call it. We all agree that we want it to be collaborative and shared. Even the big companies don't want the other big companies to be in control of it, right? So they're on board with this idea that it's going to be shared. It's something that we want, but they have different meanings when they talk about some of these words. Some of the business models of these companies are very pro-consumer, and some of the business models are things that we have a lot of concerns about the social impacts of the business models, let's say with the ad tech business model specifically. And so there's different goals, and we're going to have to get everybody on the same page, because standards are always voluntary. They don't come from the government. They come from companies working together. So we want them to adopt those standards, but we also don't want to compromise ethics along the way. We don't want to say open doesn't mean open to exploitation. Open doesn't mean open to do anything or any business model. It means we want to try to work together to come up with the common subset of what we can agree on and what really works together. And so one place that comes up, you'll hear the rhetoric a lot about walled gardens. There's a lot of discussion that the opposite of open is a walled garden. And some companies do try to trap people in ecosystems. And so that's one definition of a walled garden. But another definition of a walled garden is when the world is a jungle or a desert, then a walled garden is actually a pretty safe place to be. A walled garden is a good place to start out, but as soon as the world gets to a place where it's better than the walled garden, then the wall should come down. We should be free to go out and explore the world. So it's sort of an incubator in a sense. So the walled gardens are just a phase of time. And the challenge is, can we make it so that there's safety? So especially in virtual worlds, we see this a lot. There's a lot of a lack of safety for a lot of people, especially people who are already disadvantaged in the real world will have even more issues when entering virtual worlds. We want to make sure these places are safe, that they're encouraging for everybody to join, but we also want to make sure that when the world is ready, when the world outside the walls is ready, that these walls can come down and everything works together, and we wind up with this giant open universe that we all imagine. That's all interoperable. Interoperable is one word we probably can agree on, that it means everything does have to work together. And that's where the challenge really is. So depending on where the companies come from and what their attitudes are, they may take a different approach to this issue of walled garden versus so-called open. But I want us to be open about what the definition means, whether it is about safety, or whether it's simply about having no rules. I mean, I think that's part of this discussion.
It's interesting that you interpret open as having no rules.
I think by definition, it probably does need to have rules, because the whole idea of agreeing on interoperability is that we agree to a limited set of reality. That we don't agree that everybody does everything. We agree that we're going to all exchange data in a certain way. So there are definitely rules. The question is, there are very few standards thus far where there have been rules of behavior, where there have been rules of how the data is handled. For example, protecting the privacy of the data or giving users control of their own data. That hasn't really been a part of the equation for most things so far, and it needs to be in this case because it's so important.
I think
so. That's a really good point that you bring up in terms of privacy and data. And I think that when we are talking about the metaverse, which is a controlled environment, that's one level of concern. And then we start talking about bringing the metaverse into the real world. It's like a whole nother level of concern in terms of location and geospatial data. So Nadine, do you want to talk a little bit to that in terms of privacy concerns and geospatial?
Yeah, Avi, you're really making me think right now. And I know it's like 10 p.m. over here in the DC area, but this thing that you mentioned that we haven't, that this topic hasn't come up until recently, which, you know, yeah, it seriously makes me scratch my head, because we've been doing location and geospatial for how long? But I think the crossing point was we finally have enough, you know, analytics and, you know, processing power and AI that we're starting to become dangerous, I think, with this data, this ability to connect all this data. And that's why the topic emerged like with a vengeance, I would say. You know, it's like all of a sudden, right? Because we can get, you know, phone data and figure out where the rich people live. And, you know, you can do so much harm. You can figure out where the disadvantaged communities, like the example I'm looking, you know, Susan mentioned. So what's happening in the geospatial, the geographic, the location world is this thing called the location charter, which came up again. This is in the last couple of years, actually during the pandemic. So this is one of the good things about the pandemic, because we were talking about contact tracing and people being very sensitive, et cetera, et cetera. But this whole idea is when you know the location and the proximity and the relationships, I think you can, the examples that they have in this ethical geo initiative, I'm looking at their website as I speak, is, for instance, in the developing world, right? If you think of places like Egypt, right, where if you locate the LGBT communities, you can actually do a lot of harm. Even here in the United States or in Canada, if you can find the locations of the indigenous communities' burial sites, right? Again, so like anytime you expose this, you know, very sensitive information about people and about places, it can be, when you talk open, it can also be open to harm. So it's interesting. You really definitely made me think. It's like, why now? But actually, it's because things are coming together, and we can be dangerous with our ability to connect data in ways we've never been able to.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think a good example is something people don't think about is if I put a web server out there, and my web server is offering geospatial information, and people request that information for their mobile devices, let's say. They ask me for that geospatial information. Well, I could build the web server in such a way that I track who asked for what. So I can build a model of where you are based on the requests that you make of the data that's public data. Even if the data is public, I can invade your privacy by tracking you. And that happens quite a lot. We see it on the web. So we've learned about these exploits. We've learned about these models over the last 10, 15 years. I would have never thought that those would be issues when I started working on this, but it's turned out to be a really lucrative business model for a lot of companies. And so we do need to protect against it, yes.
In a way, it feels like some of these issues sort of come as a result of trying to focus on the monetization aspect a bit too early in the game, right? As Neil mentioned, it's like we're in the early 90s building the web. And if you look at how the web was built, it was a bunch of people really focusing on doing something for the greater good. It was, universities and researchers and things like that. The monetization came later, and the opportunities and commercialization that came was massive, but that wasn't really the founding principle behind it, right? It had a very different motivation. So when you've got companies that are very much so focused on, let's see how we can monetize this in 6 months' time, that in itself is creating a bit of an issue, right? And of course, we're dealing with technology that can be several years out. So combining those drivers is challenging in itself. But I
think you're right. Plus short-term thinking, being in these quarterly or yearly cycles instead of thinking 5 to 10 years out. It leaves us making poor decisions together, and we're measuring the wrong things for efficacy in the process.
Avi, you mentioned the walled gardens and interoperability, and I think it's interesting for us to stop and think about what we actually mean by interoperability, right? Because some people will hear standards and they assume that standards gives us interoperability, right? Well, if you look at any of the walled gardens are using HTML, CSS, JPEG, all of them within their walls, right? We don't have interoperability. So, we need to be specific about the interoperability we're looking for.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that kind of interoperability, I think, would be fostered by thinking through, for example, the nature of the content. So let's say somebody decides they want to build a place that's safe for kids. They have to now think about whether content is going to come in that's unsafe for kids. Well, if we've never coded that information into the standards and the content, we have no way of building that real-time filter. So it's easier to just build a wall and say, we can't guarantee this content, so we're just going to block it. But if we figured out a way to actually encode it, we might have a chance of breaking down some walls. There's some walls that should be there and some walls that shouldn't. And that's something that we've never really tackled well, except for voluntary rating systems and things like that. We haven't been very good at determining safety before and the impact of these things on people. So we need to think a lot about it, and how are we going to solve that this time?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I mean, the whole thing about interoperability, and to what James was saying too, it's not just getting the bits and bytes to be operable. It's a multi-layer, complex problem. And the way I think about it, just because you can take 3D assets, for example, between two different worlds, doesn't mean you should. And in all cases, and so we're going to need virtual custom posts. It's the best way I've found to explain it to people. Because you might not want just something in the real world, right? It's not appropriate to take everything everywhere, and that's why you have customs at international borders. We're going to need the same thing. It can be IP rights, it could be age appropriateness, it can be even stylistic. You can't bring your Fortnite avatar into my space simulator. You look weird, right? And so all kinds of reasons why, just because we can do interoperability, we should. And so you're absolutely right, Abby. We need to start thinking about what these custom posts are going to want to know, so they can make smart decisions on where assets can be interoperable. And if we can figure that out, then the geeks have a chance to start encoding it into the open standards that we build. So it is.
And Neil, as we think about the tooling around this, so much of it has not been in the creator's hands. And so making sure that we put not just attribution, but those permissions about where things can be reused, how they can be reused, right? Making that something that creators can then maintain some sense of trackability and control around. That got removed. There was this sense of distance between the creators and the creation. And I think we can bring that back together through these tools and how we build them effectively for artists as well as for technologists.
Yes, absolutely.
And then I wonder, how do you manage compliance, right? You build these standards for the way objects should be encoded, and how do you enforce the compliance of people following those guardrails that you're trying to create? How do you get lawmakers involved and on board?
Well, there's multiple ways. I mean, you have to approach this from every angle. So, again, from the engineering point of view, as Avi was saying, everything is voluntary. Most asset formats that are open standards will have validators and asset checkers. So people that want to be conformant to the specification have all the tooling that they need to easily check that they've created the model correctly. And if you can get an upward spiral in the ecosystem where people can sell or distribute or use those assets easily in more places if they are compliant to the specification, because the places the worlds that they're going to don't have any problems ingesting and using those assets, you can create a positive motivation cycle where people want to be compliant, not just because we said so, because they make more money more easily if they're compliant. But it is multi-dimensional. I've learned a lot from Avi in the chances I've had to speak to him, and just behavioral norms. It was a big thing, big light bulb moment when said we have to be talking now about how are we going to construct these models and how are they going to be used and what protections do we need, and just keep talking about it and building not just the open technical standards, but the behavioral norms and expectations around how we're all going to build environments where these are used. It's a very interesting social engineering problem as well as a technical engineering problem.
If I can add to this, no, go ahead.
Okay, I'll be quick. Yeah, I mean that's where the guild comes in on the education side of it. We have no intention of trying to be any kind of enforcement body, or not even a standards body, but we really want to help educate everybody as to what the issues are and how to address them voluntarily for ourselves. So once you know the issue, hopefully everybody wants to do the right thing, and then we don't need as much enforcement. But of course, other groups are working on regulation, and other groups are working on standardization, and then one more leg of that will probably ultimately be bodies like exist in Hollywood that rate things, or in the games world that rate things. Those aren't us either, but there'll be groups that put their stamp of approval when you comply with certain behavioral norms. They'll say, we vetted you and you match this criteria. And those don't exist yet. I don't even want to create those, but those will exist in the future. Go ahead, Nadine, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is good. I'm learning here as you guys are speaking. I think one of the points I was trying to make is, with related to compliance and interoperability and the value of having this conversation. For instance, in the geospatial, say in OGC, right? So we have our standards and we have our compliance tests, but usually they're geared towards geospatial people. And here it's a context where actually we have data and APIs that anybody can use, and I think that's a different frame of thinking, right? This is where this is where the conversation is like, oh, Avi, you're gonna use my data? I never thought it would be used this way. And so the metadata, right? We call it metadata, right? The metadata becomes all of a sudden something a little bit different than what you're used to, I think, adding to your data. And we've been talking about this concept of it's not just like making, say, data open, it's open to who and when is it open and for how long. So going back to Ivo's example on disasters, like, listen, I'm going to open this data to, maybe the government in this case, or the police, or, public safety, in the case of disasters, only during the disasters for the specific purpose of saving lives, and then you can reshuffle accordingly. And again, this is when just us in our geospatial bubble doing this, it will never work, because then you can never use it, because we need to be at least interoperable in terms of how we talk about this and how we use it.
So we have about 5 minutes to wrap up. Does anyone have any closing remarks? There's one thing that we didn't get to that I wanted to talk about, and that was the GeoPost standard that I I know has it been approved? Is it out in the wild yet? Yes? Okay. Can you talk a little bit about that, James and Nadine, in terms of bringing the real world and the metaverse to the virtual world together? I think this is something that's going to be key.
So I'm not the expert, so maybe James can add, but to me it's this, when we talk about things and where things are in a space, right? And GeoPose adding this whole new dimension. It's not just where, you know, my object is, but also where it's pointing, and that's very critical. It's critical for autonomous vehicles, and it's critical for your Pokemon game. So this bridging between the reality and the virtual, because you want to know where your camera or your sensor is pointing. And I find it fascinating. We're actually building right now coordinate reference systems for space, and same thing, you know, even now our satellite positioning, right? If you think about it, we're trying to sort of transcend GeoPose to space, because I also need to know where I am in this whole universe. So I think just like one little standard, right, can help connect all these use cases, I think, which is fascinating. So one standard is like where things are and where they're oriented. James, you're way more into the details, so maybe you can help other than the
No, I think that's exactly right. We tend to think of it as sort of a glue, right? Because that's how it operates. In a way, just bringing the real world into the equation is in itself necessitating additional interoperability needs, because there is one common real world that we need to interoperate with, right? So that in itself is different from sort of having different virtual worlds and things like that.
And so, Nadine, just to clarify, you're talking about where an object is in space and the orientation, and it's all relative to like the center of the Earth, right? So that's the origin. Yes? Or I guess the origin can be defined anywhere, but typically, don't you think about it as the origin is the center of the Earth?
It depends. It's your coordinate reference system, wherever that is.
Yeah. So, Neil, just quickly, and I understand that GLTF is going to adopt the GeoPose, and how important do you think this is in bringing the virtual and the real world together?
Oh, yeah.
Where does GLTF stand in all of it?
Yeah, no, we love GeoPose, and you know, there's some real good fundamental work. It's a more complex problem than you might imagine. It's not just, you know, a set of coordinates. You know, there's time, and there's a lot of skill and expertise has gone into creating a GeoPose standard. So we're absolutely going to adopt it and put it into GLTF. So you know, a GLTF asset can be geotagged, you know, to be in a particular position in the world. And we're very grateful to all the work that the OGC folks have done to create such an awesome standard.
And I know the OpenAR Cloud was instrumental in pushing that forward as well, and worked in collaboration with OGC. So we're out of time. We have 1 more minute left. I think it's really fascinating when you kind of bring all of this together. Ivo, the work that you're doing with generative art, and we didn't really get a chance to talk about it tonight, but this idea of generative 3D worlds, right? And how do you describe them? They need to be described before we can generate them using AI. And then, you know, the scene description and the GLTF and like how all of these come together, I think is really exciting and fascinating. And I wish we could have talked a little bit deeper about the 3D spaces and how it all comes together. But I think we touched on it, and we definitely your new book. Thank you, Ivo. Anybody who wants to share anything in the links, please do, because these chats stay recorded as well. The recording of the chat will be a part of the video when people come to see the video. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, James and Avi, for joining us and adding to the conversation. Really appreciate your contribution. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to prepare for this panel and to be available this evening. Really,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
really
Thanks, guys.
appreciate all the
Bye.
very important work that you all are doing.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Take care.
Have a great night.